Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Information Architecture Best Practices for 2024, featuring our special guest, Microsoft MVP, Marc Anderson. My name is Vlad Catrinescu. I'm Syskic's technical evangelist and a Microsoft MVP from Montreal, Canada. Now, you may already know Syskic as a company, but for those of you who don't, let me do a quick introduction. Syskic is a software development company founded more than 15 years ago. We develop products for Microsoft 365 governance and security, as well as for SharePoint on-premises administration. We have more than 3,500 customers around the world, ranging from small businesses to large corporations. We have 4 products, including our award-winning SP Docket for SharePoint on-prem, as well as our flagship product, Syskic Point for Microsoft 365 governance, which helps organizations get Copilot ready. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items. Yes, all registrants will receive a recording of the webinar within a few days. So if you ever need to step out for anything, or I'm sure you'll find the webinar so awesome you will want to send it to your colleagues, you will be able to do so. After the presentation, Philip from Syskic will show you how Syskic Point can help you keep your Microsoft 365 environment clean and organized. Of course, at the end, we will have a Q&A session where Marc will answer all the questions you may have. So please use the Q&A function on the right side of the screen so you can ask your questions throughout the webinar. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our special guest, Marc D. Anderson. Marc is a Microsoft MVP and the co-founder and president of Simpraxis Consulting. He has over 40 years of experience in technology, professional services, and software development. Over a wide-ranging career in consulting as well as line manager positions, Marc has proven himself as a problem solver and a leader that can solve difficult technology problems for organizations across a wide variety of industries and organization sizes. You can also listen to Marc speak at Microsoft 365 conferences around the world, as well as on the Ask Simpraxis series on YouTube. I will now give a warm welcome and turn things over to Marc. Marc, are you ready?
Let's see. I think I am. I'm going to push all the buttons that I'm supposed to push and see if I can
Push all the red ones until they turn green. That's always my tip. If it's red, you gotta press it. If it's green, it's good.
Let's see. I'm trying to share my screen and push this button. You know how it is when you're getting started. And let's see. Do you see my screen?
I see the screen that also has the subtitles in the bottom. So I do see the one with information architecture, better practice.
Yeah, okay, that's the one that I think you should see. You're not supposed to be looking at my bank account or anything like that. All right, well, thank you for that.
I thought that was SharePoint limitations because I saw the big number, but an extra bank account. SharePoint Consulting is doing good.
Yeah, right. I'm glad I at least got that right. Yeah, we technology folks are so good with things like sharing our screen. Well, thank you again, Vlad, for that introduction. It's been a wonderful community to work in for a billion years, and I am very passionate about this topic, information architecture. And I do say better practices instead of best practices, because one person's best is not necessarily another person's best. There are a lot of gray areas in all of this. This is just a little bit about what I was going to talk about. I do want to just let everybody know who may not know that we have a Microsoft 365 community content repo in learn.microsoft.com, which is written by the community, not by Microsoft. And there are some articles in here that are directly about the things that I'm going to be talking about today, including the Microsoft 365, or sorry, the maturity model for Microsoft 365, which covers a lot of the things around managing content and things like that that might be interesting to you. So I just wanted to make sure that I got that link on the screen. Okay, so let's dive into it. Any sufficiently advanced technology is equivalent to magic. One of my favorite science fiction authors from way back when I was a kid said that. Arthur C. Clarke said that years ago, and I think we see so much of that these days. You know, we see a lot of technologies coming from all of the big tech vendors that we look at and we think, well, how the hell does that work? You know, even those of us who sort of understand the inner workings of things are wowed by what happens with some of these. Oops, sorry. I think I swapped screens. What happens with some of these technologies? For example, Copilot. You know, if you see a demo of Copilot, you're probably incredibly impressed, but there's a lot of stuff underneath that has to work for Copilot to do its magic. Even the Microsoft Graph, which has been around for a long time and some of us are taking for granted these days, requires a lot of underpinnings. You know, all those edges and connections with people have to be stored somewhere, and then those queries that Microsoft does in order to make things show up in screens and like zero type searches and all that sort of stuff requires a lot of underneath work. So lots of strong information architecture is underneath all of this stuff, and somebody, it may not be you, but somebody is doing a lot of hard work in order to make this magic happen. A lot of the hard work that you can do yourself as an end user, or at least as a site owner, is thinking about some of the aspects of information technology that can lead you toward some of your own magic. There's a great article from a guy named Seth Early that I always give a link to, and the article was, there is no AI without IA. It just so happens that AI and IA have the same letters. I think it's absolutely true. I've been working with a couple of clients on Copilot pilots, and one of the things that the pilot points out is that their information architecture is nowhere near as sophisticated as the questions that they want to ask. So for example, they might want to ask, what contracts have we won in the last 15 months or something like that. Copilot will try to answer that, but it can't necessarily identify what those contracts are, or when they were opened or closed, or what happened with them. So it's artificial intelligence until you know how it works. Again, it looks like magic until you see how it actually works. And if the information isn't structured and curated in some way, then the system is often not able to give you a good answer. So what is information architecture? This is, yes, Wikipedia giving me an answer. I actually think it's a pretty good answer, and I'm not going to read it, but it's all about, it's an art and it's a science. There aren't hard answers to a lot of this, and that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. That's why I say better practice instead of best practice. What should be a content type? What should be a site column? What kind of column should that be? There's some art to that. It's not always the same answer for every environment and every need. It's all about usability and findability. People call it search. I wish we had originally called it find, because that's actually what matters. It's not that you want to be searching a lot. It's you want to find the thing that you need in order to get your job done. And so there's a lot of design, architecture, and information science that are part of that effort in order to make things work. SharePoint is still the content hub for Microsoft 365. That title is something that I think Jeff Teeper said in one of his presentations. SharePoint is not dead. SharePoint matters. SharePoint is still where we put our stuff, whether you're using Teams, you're querying things through Copilot, you're looking at the Office 365 or Microsoft 365 homepage, you're looking at OneDrive. All of that stuff is stored in SharePoint. That's where we put things. So anything that I'm talking about here applies to actually a wider range than what we think of as SharePoint, these precepts are as important as they ever have been. To me, this slide is the main areas that I think of when I think of information architecture. Each of these boxes is equally important. They're balancing, the art part of this comes into play. The balance of what matters most in your environment when it comes to accomplishing certain things will vary, but all of these really, really matter. The dark blue ones are the ones I'm going to certainly touch on in the presentation today, but all of these matter. When you're starting, if you're coming to a blank tenant and you're starting to think about, well, what do we do? How do we start to use this thing? You have to consider all of this, whether it's somebody in IT, somebody in marketing, somebody in a different department. You want to be thinking about all of this stuff in order to be able to do your work well, to find the things that you've done in the past, to know where to put things. That's a question that we get a lot. What should I use for what product should I use when, but also where should I put this thing that I'm working on? And that is part of the what product. Should I be putting this in Teams? Should I be putting it into SharePoint? Should I be putting it in wherever? So we're going to talk specifically about navigation, site columns, content types, and lifecycle today, but all of these get tied together. Listen libraries are sort of part of that as well. So perfect is the enemy of good. The 80-20 rule is absolutely your friend here. You're never going to get this all 100% right. An information architecture is an evolving animal. It's like having a pet. You have to keep feeding it, taking it for walks, scratching it under the chin. Information architecture is never done because your organization never stops changing. What may have been true a year or two ago may or may not be true today. So let's think about navigation. One of the most important things as you're building out an infrastructure for content management and content storage is to know how to get from one place to another. I always think about my dear mother, who is not a technical person at all, and she's sort of my, as Microsoft says, North Star of ineptitude with technology. So I think about accessibility in different ways. I think about accessibility from sort of the classic definition, which is, can people with screen readers read it and all that stuff. The important that is incredibly important. But I also think of accessibility as if someone lands on this home experience, whatever that is, will they know what to do? Are there enough visual cues here? If they're trying to solve a problem, are they going to be able to get to the solution of that problem, not with one click, but with a ever narrowing set of clicks or navigation that's going to get them to the place that they need to be. So navigation is incredibly important so that you can get people to those, let's get them up and working or up and solving problems as quickly as possible. There are typically two almost distinct ways of building navigation in an environment. One is the org structure. Everybody always starts with that. What are our departments? Who does what? That navigation is very important because if I know that IT has a ticketing system that I need to interact with, I'm just going to click on IT. I'm going to go there, and that's the org structure way of going. But task-based is even more important because if people don't know who does a thing, then they ought to be able to click on something like a link that says Policy Center. They don't know who owns a policy, but they do know that they're looking for a policy. So let's show them all the policies merged together into one view that allows them to accomplish the thing that they're accomplishing. It also means putting navigation items in place right up top, right up front, that for things that people do all the time. Sometimes we use the quick links web part on a page, but oftentimes we also have some navigation up there because a quick links web part is on one page, but a top level navigation node for something like resources is going to be there on a hub site anywhere that you are in the hub site. So you want to try and think about how can we get people from point A to point B as quickly as possible. Another thing that's really, really important is every link is a promise. My ex-colleague and dear friend Emily Mancini taught me this, and I repeat a lot of the things that she learned from Nielsen Norman when she took all the courses. Every link is a promise means if I click on that systems management link in that navigation, it damn well better take me to something that says systems management right up front. If I land on something and it says ServiceNow or it says, ticketing system, I don't know if I've clicked the right thing. So lots of times I'll hit the back button, figure out, well, wait a minute, is that where I clicked or did I click on the wrong thing? So you want to make sure that every link is a promise, meaning you click on something that says whatever it says and you land on the thing that does exactly that. It's sort of mind-boggling how often that's not the case. So you might want to review your navigation and just make sure that that premise holds up. And then you want to bring in your organizational voice, even in navigation. If you're a very sort of loose and happy culture versus a sort of siloed command and control kind of culture, you can even sneak that stuff into the way you build your navigation, the way you build the terms. So what is metadata? People always talk about metadata and they hate metadata and they never want to do metadata and they say they never use metadata, and so why would they ever want to do this? Well, look at this as a file name. It doesn't matter what kind of file it is. Could be an Excel file, could be a PowerPoint. If you look at this kind of file name, and we've all seen these in email, right? People mail things around all the time that have names like this. I may have 52 emails with different versions of this file, and each file name has a slightly different name because we're putting metadata in the file name itself. When was it modified? What's the project name? What's the file name? That's the whole thing. What's the project phase? We're in the go live phase. Who did it? What version is it? It's probably far more than version 5. Some random BS here. Who knows what that means? It's a final version, but actually it's not really the final version. It's the final 3 version, right? So people use metadata all the time. They just don't like being forced to use metadata. Each of these pieces of information could be pulled out and used as separate columns in a document library that would, instead of changing the file name, would change the sort of state of that object, of that file. That's a better way to go, because then, for example, if I wanted to look at all of the documents across a set of projects that are ready for go live, I could look and see if their file name has that, but they may not be spelled the same way. They may not actually have that piece of information buried in their file name. So we want to create separate columns in a document library to indicate the things that actually matter in the life cycle of this particular object. Okay, so that's how we think about metadata with files. And I did steal this from Louise Fries. I saw her do at some presentation do this years ago, and I think this is such a great slide to show to people who sort of balk at the idea of ever using metadata. Metadata matters. Metadata is data about a thing, right? It may be a data thing, like it could be a database table, and we need to know some stuff about that database table in order to know how to use it. But more likely, it's the more structured data that we wrap around unstructured files like this one, which would be, whatever kind it is. Okay, so metadata can be stored in many, many different ways. I was just touching on lists and libraries where we can add metadata columns to any list or library. So you've all probably gone through the exercise of saying, well, let's add a column to this library. Let's make it a choice column. Let's put red, yellow, green, because whatever the library is containing should have a tag of red, yellow, and green. But we can also put metadata on sites. And that's something that that we're going to see, I believe, in the demo from Syskit. But adding metadata to sites helps you understand how to deal with a site from a life cycle perspective. You know, if this site is a project site, you're going to treat it very differently than if it's a department site. Department sites usually get created and then they live forever, sort of, right? You might rename the department, but the people working in that department are going to sort of have a forever place to do that. Project sites are going to have a beginning and then the project ends. It doesn't mean that's when you delete the site, but if you know that it's a project and you know that it was for, you know, this particular purpose and you know how long it's been since somebody has used that site, then you can start to think about what to do with disposition and things like that. A lot of times, and I'll touch on this again, a lot of times people will create their information architecture focused on creating stuff and then never think about what happens in the end. The third thing on this slide is content types. I am such a proponent of content types. It's sort of one of the core concepts of what SharePoint does that many people just never use. And if you look at the maturity model for Microsoft 365 and look at the management of content competency, you'll see that it's leafed in through that all the way through from level 100 competency to level 500. With content types, we identify the business objects that matter to people, and we can build a sort of an enterprise information architecture. It's taking things up from the local, you know, the saying, you know, think globally, act locally. Well, this is sort of the reverse of that. Let's set up an information architecture globally so that we can act locally more intelligently. So content types are just a big deal. Site columns are important because content types at a basic level are collections of site columns. So let's think about when you upload something into a document library. You know, there's every time you create a site in SharePoint, you get a library called documents. When you upload something into that library, it gets a content type called document. And the columns that document has are the file name, and then 4 columns, which I'll talk about a little bit more, that you can't change, sort of system generated stuff. All you know is the file name, right? You can add site columns to that particular list or library. Well, you can add columns to that list or library, but then they're called list or library columns. They're not shared across the site or across the enterprise. Ideally, you're creating site columns at the enterprise level for things that you want to reuse, effective date, assigned to. Those are things that can be reused in lots of different ways. And then you can do things like searching across everything that's assigned to you. If you don't have a consistent way of setting up that column, if you just do it in each library, for example, those column names won't have the same internal name or crawled property. So you won't be able to do those looking across the umbrella kind of stuff. So reuse of site columns is really important, and you sort of build them over time. I don't think that you generally will sort of say, well, this is our list of 10 site columns and now we're going to build those and then we're done. This is something that you sort of continue to expand. It's your set of site columns, your set of content types is an asymptotic effort, meaning it approaches nirvana, but you never get there, right? It's like I said, IA is always moving, always evolving, and so should your site columns and your content types because they're components of that architecture. Site columns, if they're defined at the site level or at the enterprise level, can become crawled properties, which can then be mapped to managed properties. And I won't go too much into the detail of how that works, but that all happens in the search schema, and that allows you then to set up more curated search experiences like a policy center, where you're storing the content in each of the department sites, but I can go to one place and see all of the policies that have not expired, or all the policies that are assigned to a particular person, if that made sense. So site columns are incredibly important. Try not to act too locally. Try to at least be thinking at the site level, But if you're in information architecture, thinking at the tenant level, at the content services level in the SharePoint Admin Center. So people have to have permissions to do this stuff. They need to be able to think through the ramifications of setting up the search schema to do certain things. This is all a jigsaw puzzle that has to come together in order to help you build good content types and good information architecture. So a content type is a collection of structured or unstructured data, meaning it's got that blob of a file, or if it's a list, it's got a name, and then all of that, the structured and unstructured data that is part of that blob. So the blob of stuff that's in the file with the metadata wrapped around it, that's a business object. You use these things at work all the time and at home all the time. Hey, honey, do we have a shopping list? A shopping list is a content type. When you're talking about a shopping list, you're not talking about an invoice. You're not talking about a credit card bill. Those things that you think of and use in sentences are your business objects. So depending on what industry you're in, some things will be specialized to your industry and some will be totally common to everybody. Every company everywhere does contracts with people. They pay invoices. They have status reports. They do meeting agendas. Those are common business objects. And then you might have some that are very specific to you. If you're in mining and gas or mining and if you're in mining, you might have something like a drilling plan. Nobody else is going to have one of those because that's very specific to your industry. Every content type you build inherits from an existing content type. So sort of starting off the bat, if you're creating a document-oriented content type like contract, you could inherit from document. And then you start to give contract a smarter set of metadata, but the content type name itself is a piece of metadata. If it's a contract, then you know it's a contract. That's sort of helpful. Right there, you're making more sense than you would if you just have everything called a document. So these are some sort of common content types that I see people setting up all the time. You want to think about what your list is. It's not the same from place to place. And even some of these that are common may not be as important to you in your organization as it would be to somebody else. So again, art and science here. So a content type inherits from existing content types. A lot of people sort of get angry about this title column that's everywhere. And the reason the title column exists is because basically every content type in SharePoint inherits from item. An item just has a title. And it has those columns that I was talking about, sort of system managed columns, created by, modified, and modified by. Every object in SharePoint has those four. But an item just has a title. Document actually inherits from title. You can't change that. It's not something you would ever want to touch. And it adds the name, which is the file itself. So right there, you've got some inheritance, and that makes sense. And then when you want to set up your own content types, you inherit from one of the existing content types that SharePoint has. In this case, if we're building a content type for contract, we're probably going to inherit from document. And we're going to therefore get title and name because those were part of document. But then we can add additional metadata that is useful for us in order to accomplish something. Don't start thinking about metadata that you might maybe want to collect for some reason. I always have these extremes that I like to talk about. There was a library I saw one time that had 200 columns, and most of them were required. And nobody could fill it out because nobody could ever accomplish filling out the metadata for that object because there was so much of it and you never knew all of it at the same time. And so people couldn't use it. The library stayed empty because people said, I can't deal with this. The right amount of metadata is, it's not huge and it may not be small, but it's, I always say 5 to 7 plus or minus 2 to 3. I mean, in other words, there's no answer to that. It's the things that you want to know about an object in order to to be able to manage them well, manage the life cycle, manage the content management part of it, make sure you know what the disposition of this thing should be. So for example, with a contract, you might want to know, well, when was the contract date? When was it signed? How much was it for? When does the contract expire? Who is the contract owner within the organization? And if you think about each one of these, they tell you something about what you might want to do with that contract. So for example, if you have a contract with an IT support firm and it's coming up on expiration, then the contract owner should get in touch with them. Well, you can't know that unless you track it somewhere else. And lots of times people will track it in some Excel spreadsheet somewhere. But if you have that metadata on the library where you're storing your contracts, then you've got the data right with the document instead of in that spreadsheet way over there. So oftentimes it's a matter of combining those two resources together. So then if you have an effective information architecture using content types and metadata and site columns, you can start to answer the questions that people actually ask in your business. How many proposals did we lose in the last month? And if you think about it, what piece of information do we need to know about proposals in order to answer that question? Which policies need to be reviewed for accuracy and by whom? How much revenue are we generating for each type of contract? So you're never going to get, and in fact, you should never be trying to aim for answering every question that might ever come up with metadata. But the most common ones, the things that you need reports for, are the things that you probably want to start thinking about metadata for. Views and lists and libraries are, if they're built right, reports. All documents is not a useful view unless you're really just trying to process everything. If you have a view that says lost proposals and you could even have last month's lost proposals as a view, because that's something you could define, then you have something that's actionable, something that helps you make better decisions, something that says this is what you need to do next. This is your basket of work. If you don't have metadata, you can't do that. You just have a lot of views. Now, you may say, but we use folders for that. Great. But then you're moving files from folder to folder if you have a process, which means any link you have to it is broken. Or you've got so many layers of folders that actually contain metadata in their names that people can't find anything. A really important thing about this is that, and I've been having some conversations with Joanne Klein recently. We're trying to sort of merge our brains and think about, I think about information architecture a lot. She thinks about retention a lot. And how do we bridge that gap? If you think about it, most retention schedules, most record managers will build a huge document that defines what they want to do. And almost everything is sort of defined as a content type, right? So, we need our contracts to be kept for 5 years after they expire. Well, how can you do that if you don't know where your contracts are? If you've just got a folder called contracts, there's no mechanism for that. And you can't have different metadata for the stuff in contracts folder versus the thing in the marketing plan folder. You have to think about how you're going to have different lists and libraries with different metadata structures, different content types applied to them, so that you can actually identify what the thing is. I have a client that has a 300-line retention schedule, but never thought about how you'd implement it. And how you do this in Purview is unfortunately a little bit too complicated. That's why Joanne and people like Joanne can make a good living at it. But if you haven't built a good information architecture, getting to retention, starting to think about that end of life cycle disposition stuff gets really hard, because all you've got is a pile of stuff and you can't really apply different models to it because you don't know what's what. So retention is not a one size fits all thing. You think you might be doing good retention when you apply like keep everything for 7 years. Well, then you're just carrying along a lot of junk for 7 years that you actually shouldn't be keeping at all. If you can't distinguish what stuff is, then that's the wrong answer. Organizations that get to a maturity level where they want to manage content life cycles often say, oh, you know what, we don't know what anything is. So you want to be thinking about this. And in fact, we often will build intranets and team sites and all this stuff, and not touch the concept of disposition, of retention, until we've got enough in place that we can identify what the answer is. And there are some vagaries to the way this works in SharePoint and in the compliance center, aka Purview, that means you've sort of got to take your goals and morph them into what is possible and what's the best way to do it. So doing some of this stuff up front, or deciding to do it in the middle of your sort of evolution, means that you can start to do much more intelligent retention and disposition. The other thing that I'm finding is an interesting, it's an interesting quandary, is different organizations think about when something is a record differently. So is it a record when you first create a document, or is it a record when you publish it and share it with somebody else, or is it a record when you put it in a particular place for long-term storage? That's a big question, and there's not a lot of consistency across organizations there. But if you think about it, if you have some metadata on those objects, you can start to do that well. So this is stuff I'm learning a lot from Joanne on, and she's hopefully learning some things from me too, because I think we're sort of focused on these separate ends of a content life cycle, and the middle has to tie together. And I'm pretty excited about some of the thinking that we're doing there. Okay, so switching topics a little bit. This is something that is important if you want to have a sophisticated content, a sophisticated, losing my mouth, information architecture. Content types are incredibly important. They're like a building block that you should all know about, but they also can and should relate to each other. This is a very common kind of approach that I will use when I'm working with a client. We have the SharePoint content type of document. We have something that I've always called an interstitial content type. So an organizational based document. Usually instead of org, it says, the name of the company or the organization. We never use that for anything. We never actually say, well, this is going to be the library where we put our org-based documents, because that's not a business object for us. But it gives you an inheritance layer that allows us to say something like, show me everything that is important enough to have a custom content type. And that has to do with how you set up search-driven experiences and stuff like that. And then from inheriting from that, you might have something like a parent content type, like contract. Contract is certainly a valuable content type, and you might have a library in one place that contains contracts, just general contracts. But you also might want to manage things like real estate contracts and employment contracts differently, because real estate contracts are about buildings and employment contracts are about people. So if you think about it, you have a difference in the metadata, right? The real estate contracts ought to have what building is it? The employment contract ought to have what person is it about? So by building that inheritance, you inherit all of the settings and site columns from the parent content type. So real estate contract and employment contract can inherit those site columns that I had on contract, but then add that additional piece of metadata that matters for them. Then if you add something to the organizational based document or the contract content type, and you have a choice, but you almost always check the box or leave it checked, then you can have it apply to all of the children. That starts to make some really robust information architecture capabilities, and let you breathe and grow with the organization. So A lot of this becomes iterative. You set up contract in one way and you realize, oh, darn it, I gave it the wrong parent and I should do it another way. So there's a lot of sort of moving forward 2 steps and 1 step back, forward 2 steps, back 1 step, especially in the beginning. That's healthy. That iterative, making sure we've got it right, means that lots of times you're building a library and then tearing it back down and then building it again and applying a content type, making sure the content works. You're thinking about it not just from the information architecture down, but also from what's the content up. So, if we only have 3 contracts in the entire organization, we probably don't need to do this. But if we've got 10,000 of them, we need to think about it very differently, and we want to make sure that we get it right. PNP Modern Search is one of my favorite tools, and I love building things like this policy center, which I've mentioned a couple of times. You can't build stuff like this unless you have a good information architecture. You see here, I'm showing policies that are owned by different departments. And department owner in this case is just the name of the site that lets me filter, right? I've got a search box, I've got a department filter, I could even filter by policy owner or effective date so that I can find things as easily as possible. You want to run through those use cases. Why would people be coming here? What would they be looking for, and why would they be looking for it? So let's support them in that way. This is a relatively simple search-driven page, but the simplicity here provides far more capability than you would ever get by routing around in different folders in different department sites or searching and getting a whole bunch of things that are not even policies. They just have the word policy in them. This slide is something that's a part of the maturity model for Microsoft 365, and it's in that management of content competency. I like to have it in this deck because to me, this is level 400. So this is pretty sophisticated. But if you think about the life cycle of something, you create an object, you iterate on it to make it what it is. We're writing a new procedure. We don't have it right when we start writing it. We have it right as we work together on it. We review it somehow. We sort of, as a group, say, I'm in the IT department, I'm working on this procedure. We sort of put it through the IT process that has to happen, and then at some point we publish it. And if you're publishing something for the intranet, it's on a communication site, the IT communication site, where people will consume it. They are just readers of that thing. We still have the original object that we worked on in the IT team site, because the next time we want to work on it, it's there. It becomes the next version that we then publish to the communication site. Now, some of these things might start in OneDrive and then move to a team site. I think I like working out loud more. I like sort of just starting everything in team sites rather than OneDrives. But if you are a culture where people say, oh, I'm not going to show you anything until I get it right, well, then OneDrive might be a good starting point, and then you publish it to the team site. So that's a publishing gesture. And then you publish it to the communication site when it's done. The other important thing here is, especially with content that a lot of people are consuming, is you've got to have a feedback loop. If someone, you're getting a bunch of feedback about this procedure that when people read it, it doesn't make any sense. You want to make sure that you're collecting that feedback, and then you're putting the content through another cycle. The part that's not on this slide, now that I'm learning more from Joanne, is, okay, but what about the disposition of this thing when it's done? So great, we've been publishing this thing out onto the intranet. What if it gets stale enough that it should go away, or we need to retain it because of some legal reason? So this diagram probably ought to reflect that at some point as well. There are different ways to sort of implement and roll out a good information architecture. I'm not going to go to the details of this slide, but there are some tools that Microsoft gives us. In the content type hub, we can set up things through a UI. We can build site templates. The one thing I want to say about site templates is I rarely set up a site template as a template for a site. That sounds really weird, doesn't it? I use them as components. So I might have a site template that only builds the policies library, applies the right content type to it, and therefore sets up some views. So I look at site templates as building blocks that site owners can apply to their site when they need something. Either, maybe we say, finance is never going to have any policies, so we're not going to give them a library. And then, of course, finance does want some policies. So rather than having to get in touch with the admins or get some sophisticated thing going on, the site owners can just go into the gallery of site templates that we've given them and say, give me a policies library. Building those things is a little geeky, but once you have them, they're very easy to apply. The thing that makes no sense to me at all is that site templates can't work with pages. You can't set anything on the home page, which is one thing that you'd really want with a site template. P&P provisioning templates will let you work with pages, but it's also more complicated. It's incredibly powerful. You can do pretty much anything you want with provisioning and setup. And then there are third-party products like Syskit that help you with provisioning and metadata management and all kinds of things. But those cost money. So you want to think about what you want to build versus what you want to buy. Here's some resources for you. I'm sure that those will get into some form that you can click on sometime soon from the Syskit folks. And I think with that, I am going to say I'm done. I'm going to wake up the Syskit folks and say, let's move into the demo portion of the call.
You're done, but we're only giving you a break, Mark, because you have some awesome questions waiting for you. But Mark, thank you so much for the awesome presentation. And for everyone that didn't put in their questions yet, please go ahead, put them in the Q&A on the right side of the screen in the Q&A widget. This way, we try to find a question that Mark cannot answer. I've been trying for about 10 years now to find one, but he can answer everything. So maybe you can all help me. But before that, we'll give Mark a little break and we'll get Philip from Syskit, who will show you how Syskit Point can help you keep your Microsoft 365 environment clean and organized. Philip, are you ready?
Yes, just checking whether you can hear me.
I hear you and I can see the screen. I see it. You're good to go.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Vlad, and thank you, Mark, for the presentation. I'm Philip from Syskit, and today I'm going to show you a quick overview of Syskit Point and some of its features that relate to information architecture. Vlad mentioned Syskit Point at the beginning of the presentation, but I'm just going to give you a bit more detail so you can grasp the concept a bit better. Point is an end-to-end solution that helps you easily manage your Microsoft 365 environment. It allows you complete visibility over your entire tenant, including your workspaces, users, and file structures. You can easily govern what is happening by creating automated policies and rules, which means less manual and repetitive work for you. But the best way to showcase all of this is to see it in action. So let's jump straight into Point. And I'd like to show you a couple of features that will help with maintaining better information architecture in your tenant. Like Mark mentioned in his presentation, we need to be thinking at the high level, that is at the level of the tenant. So let's start by provisioning, by exploring some provisioning options. Provisioning is important because it makes sure that new workspaces are set up correctly right from the start. And the best way to make sure that everything is set up the way you want to is to choose how you want your information architecture to look. So let's start by creating a new template, for example, for SharePoint site. And let's just, for the sake of this demonstration, use HR workspace. This is the workspace for the HR. Now, here, if we leave the settings as their default, we start from scratch with a completely empty site with the default settings. But if we choose copy from the existing site, we can select another workspace that is already set up the way we want it to be set up, and that we want all future workspaces in this category to be set up. And we can copy its structure and content for each new workspace that follows this template. So let's select, for example, HR News. and we can select that we're going to copy the structure of this existing workspace. This allows you to create all the information you want your workspace to have and then apply them to newly provisioned workspaces. Now, of course, there are a lot more options you can set up in each template regarding admins, owners, members, sharing settings, permissions, sensitivity labels, metadata, which is also important as we saw in Marc's presentation, and a whole bunch of different settings so you can get really detailed with setting up new workspaces the way you want them to look. This is also important because it gives us some new capabilities. So if we go to the rules section of Point, Rule Engine allows you to set up automated rules and policies that are going to govern your entire tenant without you having to manually do everything all the time. So for example, let's create a new rule. Let's call it the HR workspace. Once again, rule for HR workspaces. And under condition, let's say that the department is HR, or that the purpose, which is a custom metadata, is team collaboration. And we can also make this exclusive. So if either of these conditions are met, we're going to apply certain policies to the workspaces that meet this criteria. One of the most important policies you can apply is the access review, which makes sure that only the right people have access to the workspace, which continues to make sure that your environment is healthy and secure. Also, let's apply another policy, for example, the maximum number of owners. You know that it's important to have the set minimum and maximum number of owners, so your workspaces don't end up orphaned. And you can also make sure that the workspace is not shared with everyone. This is important because regardless whether you're getting ready for Copilot or you just want to prevent oversharing and data leakage, this rule engine allows you to make sure that your governance is fairly effortless while making sure that everything in your environment stays secure. But as we all know, sometimes we don't set things right the right way from the start. And sometimes things change and we need to review and see whether the information we had at the beginning is still relevant today. And this is important, like Marc said, also at the workspace and the site level in regards to metadata. Because if anybody during Marc's presentation was thinking, okay, I'm interested, like you mentioned, it's going to be presented in the demo, that how we can apply metadata at the site level, you're in luck because that's exactly what we're going to go through right now. And just to reiterate, metadata is important because it helps you with governance and cleanup. And once you have metadata for your workspaces, you can create powerful rules that govern your tenant without you having to do manual work. And you also have the ability to delegate tasks to owners so they can fill out or review metadata for their workspaces and make sure that everything is either filled out or that it's still correct. So let's filter out the HR sites since we're using HR for some reason for this presentation. And we can, under Manage Metadata, choose Ask Owners. Here we can select the metadata we want owners to review. So let's choose project end date and purpose. And let's write please reviews. And once the action is complete, owners of these workspaces will receive a link in their email, which will open a task that they need to fill out. And that task looks like this. So if we go into here, for example, you can see that some of the metadata is already filled out and some of the information is missing. And we can simply click and choose the new information that we want. Here, we can choose you can choose manually workspace end date here, but we can also do this for multiple workspaces at once. So if we select everything, we can choose the purpose is team collaboration, update rows, and then we can complete this review. And then immediately, this is going to be applied across your entire tenant. So you're making sure that everything in your tenant is up to date and that your environment is secure. We're working on bringing the same functionality to managing both privacy and sensitivity labels. Just keep in mind that it only is at the level of the workspaces. And these are just a few features that Syskit Point has to offer. And the best way to experience it yourself is to sign up for a 21-day free trial and test it out. And if you have any questions regarding this, feel free to drop them in the chat. Thank you for your attention. And I think we're going to be going back to Vlad.
Thank you, Philip, for the excellent presentation. And now it's time for the Q&A with Marc. Marc, are you ready for some questions?
Questions are hard. Yes, of course.
I know, but at least you don't have to prepare for them. You either know them or you don't. At least that's what I tell myself.
I don't know is a totally acceptable answer.
It is. So the first one, I'm not sure if it's a question or a warning to people, but it says no spaces and funny characters in the site column name. If you do, I will find you and make you change your ways. Anything you want to add to that about the spaces and funny characters?
That may be sort of part of the science of this. When you're setting up things like site columns, you want to make sure that you don't use any special characters when you first create them. So for example, assign to with no spaces. And then you rename the site column with a space so that it looks nice. That's the display name. That internal name never changes. And if you use a space, then it says assigned underscore X0020 underscore by. So you get sort of ugly internal names, which makes those of us who look at things with code and sort of have to deal with the information architecture over time say, oh, damn you. So just there are some rules in there, and actually some articles in the Microsoft 365 community docs cover exactly those naming tricks. So I would look for that article there. I can find that link.
But at the same time, if you want to piss off your developer friends, just mix up the internal names between two columns in the same library. So when they set up everything, they spend hours troubleshooting, right?
Yeah, well, and that's part of the thing where sometimes you actually want to back out because you might create a column called assigned to, and then over time, because you've done some iteration, it actually isn't the assigned to person, it's the responsible party or something like that. And you've renamed the display name, but the internal name, display name is responsible party, and the internal name is the ugly assigned to, and then you can't link the two. Every name is a promise in this case. So sometimes it actually is worth then peeling everything back and naming it correctly once you've decided what it's going to be.
Awesome. Okay, now question. I'm sure you've heard this one a bunch of times. What pain points have you found with using content types and getting them used inside Teams associated sites? Because it seems like a lot of Teams content or a lot of people using Teams just end up dumping everything in the default library with folders.
Right. Well, I think Microsoft made a huge mistake when they decided they were going to take over the documents library and have each channel be a folder. They sort of encourage us to just, most organizations were using that library for slightly more sophisticated stuff, and now we're just dumping junk in there with it. So it's part of that whole content lifecycle thing. Usually what we're using in Teams and we have in files is the stuff we're sort of currently noodling on, working around, whatever. But you can also have tabs to more sort of real libraries. So in a team site, on the back end in SharePoint, you can create multiple document libraries that contain different stuff that you want to treat as more sort of permanent content. But you can also have tabs to it so you can get to it easily from Teams. But I think of the documents library now as the sort of work in progress, or whatever we're saving for whatever reason. It's the junk. It's not going to have good retention policies applied to it because it's just a pile of stuff. And you need to, if you have content that you want to treat in a more sophisticated way, you need to think about building a more robust information architecture.
And I guess this is a follow-up question that I think you answered. How does SharePoint information architecture integrate with Teams? Should you use Teams as the SharePoint hub? I guess that has to do with a lot of things in SharePoint and Teams, but I'll let
Yeah.
you take that easy question.
Well, and there's not an answer to that, right? It's all about what the unit of work is that team represents. So, if it's a team for a department to just do their work, the HR department over many, many years, well, you're going to have all kinds of stuff in there, and you may or may not need to organize it in a particular way. But things like employee files probably should be in a very dedicated library that has a more robust information architecture. On the other hand, if you have like the company lunch planning team, who cares, right? It's only going to happen once, and it's going to be over. And whatever organization works for that to happen is fine. And then you're probably just going to throw it away because you're not going to do it again, or you keep it for the next time in case you need a reference. So there's no answer to these things. That's the art part.
Awesome. Okay, so now a very technical question. What is the difference between OWS underscore and OWS underscore tax ID in the term store with crawled properties? That works so much better when you show it rather than just say it. But
yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't get the beginning of that question.
so what is the difference between the OWS underscore and then you have an OWS underscore tax ID in the term store?
Yep. So the OWS underscore name of column is just the label. OWS tax underscore tax ID underscore whatever is the object. Objects in the term store have two GUIDs actually, and the label. You want to use the tax ID one if if you even think there's a possibility of having multiple languages, because there's localization built into that whole process. And I admit I've been erring on, living in the US and everybody speaking English, I err on the side of using just the OWS underscore label, name of the column, because there's never going to be another language, so it doesn't really matter. The OWS underscore tax ID is the one that's got better capabilities. You probably want to use that if you're even remotely thinking about multilingual or other sophisticated ways of using terms.
Awesome. I'm learning things. Is it better to have lots of small task-driven sites compared to a large department-driven site? For example, should you have an accounts payable site or just one big accounting site?
It depends. I haven't said that on this call. It does depend though. If your accounting department is 3 people and accounts payable is one half of one of those people, then you probably don't need multiple team sites. If you've got 40 people in accounts payable out of 150 people in finance, then you might even need multiple accounts payable teams because people are focused on different stuff. It's all about what is that unit of work that you're trying to support. The other thing that I recommend is that we try to keep permissions always at the team site at the Microsoft 365 group level. Don't start carving out permission holes in like specific libraries and folders, because then nobody understands who has access to what. If you find that you have some content that should be shared with a different group than the group that is the owner of that team site, maybe you need another team site. That's often a reason to think about, accounts payable needs 2 of them because whatever. It's because of a separate set of permissions.
Awesome. Okay, now maybe a tip, but also I'd love to have your input on this. SharePoint Premium, previously known as Syntax, can help with tagging and filling in metadata columns, which, let's be honest, most people do not love to do.
People don't mind doing it if they see a benefit to themselves, right? So that's an important part of this. This is a change management process. It's not just all right, you have to put in these 4 pieces of metadata without ever talking to the people who have to do it. That's a conversation. Syntax will absolutely help, especially in the cases where you've got repeatable objects, right? Like we're getting contracts in all the time, or we're getting invoices in all the time. They're predictable business objects. Content types matter to Syntax / SharePoint Freemium because you have to know what the thing is. You can't, it just doesn't make sense to sort of throw everything in a pile and expect some magic system sorting. So it absolutely can help. And I think the important thing is that none of these systems are perfect. They still need some sort of validation. I think people are still necessary, and hopefully will still be necessary for a good long time.
Awesome. Mark, thank you very much. There's only one final request. If you have any resources that you would love people to go to, add them when you send us the slides and we'll send them to everybody. People loved the presentation, so that is awesome. And thank you everybody for joining us on today's webinar. I know I had a few questions in the Q&A. Everybody will get the recording, and Mark confirmed that he was nice enough that he'll also send the slides as well. So if you want to review some of the things, if you want to look over them with your colleagues, you are more than welcome to. And Mark, thank you again for the awesome presentation today. It was amazing. I do this a lot, and I still learned a lot from your presentation, which is
that's good to hear.
And I love the angle of putting your brains together with compliance, which is such a big thing today with retention, compliance, all of that, and giving that angle as well. It was amazing. Any final words for people before we wrap up?
I don't think so. Just thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate all of you out there, interest in information architecture. If you have any questions after the fact, you can find me on all the Twitters and things, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. And anyone, if you have any further questions about Syskit or any of our products, make sure you reach out to us at sales@syskit.com. It was a pleasure having you all here, and see you next time. Bye-bye.